The morning fog rolled over Mary Mead like a heavy blanket, the village shrouded in an eerie stillness that whispered of something sinister unfolding. The air, thick with tension, seemed to hold its breath. Miss Marple had sensed it, the inevitability of another death. She had prepared herself for this. A single murder could be a coincidence, but two, that was something entirely different. As the news spread, the quiet village of Mary Mead was no longer a sanctuary of simple scandals. Its peace had been shattered. Miss Marple, wrapped in her sensible grey coat, moved through the streets with her usual quiet grace, her eyes flicking to the gathered group of villagers near Iris Henderson's cottage. Their hushed voices, laden with fear and speculation, barely masked the unease gripping them. They had gathered outside her cottage, no longer able to contain their suspicions, but unsure of what to make of it all. Miss Marple knew the look in their eyes, desperation. They wanted answers, but more than that, they wanted reassurance. The details were filtered through in broken snippets. She was found just sitting there, like she was waiting to be discovered. One woman murmured, her voice trembling, "The police say it's just like before, some symbol left behind, a white lily, just like Abbott." The name sent a ripple of shock through the crowd, and Miss Marple's heart skipped a beat. Peter Abbott, the first victim. Now Iris Henderson was the second, and she had no doubt it was no accident. Iris Henderson had always been a fixture of the village, a widow for 10 years, financially comfortable but utterly unremarkable. She was the kind of person who would gossip over tea, never the center of attention, yet her death spoke volumes. No one could have predicted it, just as no one had predicted Peter Abbott's demise. The village had been lulled into believing that such horrors were things of distant cities, not their own quiet streets. But Miss Marple knew better. She had seen the signs. The small crowd parted as Miss Marple approached the cottage. Their eyes followed her, some in hope, others in fear. As she entered the cottage, she immediately felt the oppressive weight of the silence. The parlor was immaculate, almost too perfect. A tea tray sat untouched on the low table, a single scone resting on a china plate, as if someone had merely stepped away for a moment. Yet the stillness of the room told a different story, and there in her favorite armchair by the fire, sat Iris Henderson, or what remained of her. The woman was perfectly composed, still dressed in a navy blue dress that had seen better days, hands folded gently in her lap, her face serene as though in sleep. But Miss Marple knew it wasn't sleep, it was death. The stillness was unnerving, unnatural, and then there was the flower, a single white lily, carefully laid across Iris's lap. Miss Marple exhaled slowly, recognizing the chilling pattern. The same symbol had appeared at the first murder, a playing card in Abbott's hand, and now a white lily in Henderson's. It was too calculated, too deliberate to be a coincidence. A message was being sent, but to whom, and what did it mean? Behind her, Constable Henry Graves muttered in resignation, his voice thick with frustration. "Poison," he said, sounding defeated. Just like Abbott, no sign of struggle. She just sat down for tea, and never got up again. Miss Marple's sharp gaze swept over the room. She took in every detail, the perfect arrangement of curtains, the way the sugar bowl's lid had been left askew, the faint scent of lavender soap still lingering in the air. Every detail mattered. It was all too neat, too well placed, as if someone had carefully staged the scene. But why? Her eyes fell upon the bookshelf. Her fingers hovered over the spines, until she found what she was searching for. A small, insignificant book of nursery rhymes. She carefully pulled it from the shelf, flipping through the pages, and there, pressed between the pages of a rhyme, was another white lily, fragile, delicate, withered with age. A chill ran down Miss Marple's spine as she realized what this meant. This wasn't just a random symbol. The rhyme, the lily, it was all connected. She could hear the distant echoes of the nursery rhyme in her mind, a stolen tart, a weeping queen, a fleeing maid. It was a puzzle. One that was slowly coming together piece by piece, but what was the final picture? With a deep breath, Miss Marple began to piece together the fragments. The connection between the two murders was clear, but the questions were piling up faster than the answers. Who was behind this? And why these victims? She knew she had to dig deeper before the killer struck again, before the village's peaceful facade was shattered forever. And now a flower, the sort one lays at a grave. She turned back to the room. Henry was watching her with the long-suffering patience of a man who knew he was already several steps behind. "Have that look about you, Miss Marple," he said wearily. "The one that means you've already got it half worked out." Miss Marple gave him a small non-committal smile. "It not entirely worked out, Henry, but I do believe I am beginning to see the rhythm of things, and outside, beyond the walls of the small cottage, the village continued to hum with life, unaware that death had not yet finished its work. The band's drawing room was a place of old comfort, worn but well-kept furniture, the scent of lemon polish lingering in the air, and the ever-present feeling that too many conversations had been conducted in hushed tones beneath its high-beam ceiling. It was the sort of room in which the past lingered, where the weight of old family portraits and heavy drapes made one feel that secrets had been exchanged here for generations. This afternoon the air was thick with something else, a collective unease. Dolly Bantry poured tea with the same determined air she always did, as though ensuring everyone had a full cup might somehow set the world right. Her husband, Colonel Bantry, stood near, the half-arms crossed, the posture of a man who much preferred battles with clear enemies, rather than the nebulous threat of a murderer moving unseen among them. Seated in various armchairs and sofas were a few other notable villagers. Dr. Elworth, the local physician whose expression was grim, Reverend Milton, mild-mannered but visibly troubled, and of course Miss Marple, sitting with her knitting in hand, her bright eyes scanning the room with quiet amusement, as if merely an observer to the moment, rather than the architect of it. "Well," Dolly said, settling into her seat, "we can't very well go on like this, can we? 2 deaths in a fortnight and people are starting to eye their neighbors like foxes in a pen-house." Colonel Bantry grunted. "Can you blame them? First Abbott, now Iris Henderson. If there's a pattern to this, we had best find it before the blasted constable does something useless like setting a curfew." Dr. Elworth stirred his tea but did not drink it. "There is a pattern," he said. "The method poison, no sign of struggle, and then there's the theatrics." He glanced at Miss Marple first, a playing card, now a flower. "That sort of thing doesn't happen without meaning." "Something precisely," Miss Marple said, setting her knitting needles down. "The difficulty, of course, is understanding what it means before we have a third occurrence." A heavy silence followed. It was Reverend Milton who broke it. "I don't suppose it could be some kind of madman?" he asked hopefully. Miss Marple smiled kindly at him. "My dear Reverend, I very much doubt that. The trouble with madmen is that they are often terribly disorganized. They do not tend to favor such careful precision." Dolly Bantry leaned forward. "You've a theory, Jane. I can see it in that frightfully clever little face of yours." Miss Marple gave a slight shrug. "I have the beginnings of a notion perhaps a pattern is emerging, but I suspect it has been long in the making." Dr. Ellsworth frowned. "Long in the making." Miss Marple's expression was mild, but her voice carried a note of certainty. "Revenge is a dish best served cold, Doctor, and our murderer, whoever they are, has been planning this for quite some time." Colonel Bantry let out a sigh. "Last it all, do we know what links the victims yet?" Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. "We do." All eyes turned to her. She smiled, just a little. "I do believe we are following a rather morbid nursery rhyme." Reverend Milton blinked. "A nursery rhyme?" Miss Marple nodded. "Yes. The playing card, the flower, are not arbitrary, they correspond to an rhyme, one that tells a tale of deception, theft and punishment." Dolly gasped. "That wretched thing about the King of Hearts and his stolen tart." Miss Marple inclined her head precisely. A silence settled over the room as the realization took shape. "But surely, Jane, that's just a children's rhyme." "But surely, Jane, that's just a children's rhyme." Miss Marple gave him a shrewd look. "My dear Reverend, I have found that the simplest stories are often the ones people remember most, and people, particularly those with grievances, do so love a bit of poetic justice. Dr. Ellsworth shifted in his chair. So the murderer is reenacting this rhyme. Miss Marple nodded. A stolen tart, a weeping queen, a fleeing knave. And now flower, the sort one places at a grave. She looked at the group meaningfully. I believe we are watching a buried crime being repaid. Step by careful step, Colonel Bantry exhaled sharply. Then we need to stop this lunatic before they finish their game. Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the fire. Yes, she murmured. We do. And yet a nagging thought lingered in her mind. Who in St. Mary Me had been waiting all these years to settle an old score, and how many more verses of the rhyme were yet to be played out? The fire crackled softly in Miss Marple's sitting room, sending flickering shadows across the floral wallpaper outside the village of St. Mary. Me was settling into an uneasy night. Windows were shuttered. Earlier than usual, the familiar chatter of evening walkers, conspicuously absent from the narrow laypanes sphere, had crept into the fabric of daily life. And Miss Marple felt it as keenly as anyone. She sat in her armchair, a woolen shawl draped over her shoulders, her knitting untouched on the small table. Beside her the weight of the day lingered in the quiet space, the whispered theories over tea, the concerned murmur at the grocer's, the furtive glances exchanged between villagers, who were no longer entirely sure whom they could trust. 2 murders, Peter Abbott and Iris Henderson, both poisoned, both carefully staged with deliberate symbols left behind, a playing card and a white lily. And now a village, steeped in unease, its people carrying the silent, unspoken question. Who will be next? She had seen it before. How violence, once it took root in a place, had a way of seeping into every crack, every whispered conversation, every sidelong glance. Mary Me had always been a village of secrets, of small grudges and lulled resentments. But this was something else. She sighed, rubbing her hands together lightly as she stared into the fire. There were moments, rare though they were, when she wondered if she should leave such matters to younger, her more official minds. After all, she was just an elderly woman, a retired governor, a quiet spinster, who should by all accounts have long since resigned herself to a peaceful, uneventful life. But that had never quite been her way. Miss Marple had lived long enough to know that evil did not announce itself with a flourish. He did not always come in the form of a glaring, obvious villain. More often than not, it nestled comfortably into the most unsuspecting corners, behind the polite smiles of neighbors, in the carefully measured words of shopkeepers, in the familiar rhythm of village life, where one rarely questioned what had always been. It was precisely because she was an old woman, because she was quiet and unassuming, that people tended to forget she was watching. And oh, how she watched! She reached for her notebook, flipping to a fresh page. The pattern. She wrote the words neatly, underlining them once below. She listed the known facts. Peter Abbott, former schoolmaster, poisoned, found with a playing card, the King of Hearts. Iris Henderson, widow, poisoned, a white lily, placed in her lap a playing card, a flower. Miss Marple tapped the end of her pencil. Against her chin a pattern. She turned to a previous page, where she had scrolled lines from the old nursery rhyme. The King of Hearts. He made a tart, and so they stole it plain. The Queen, she wept, the knave. He fled, and Ned was seen again. A stolen tart, a grieving queen, a vanishing knave. She had no doubt that this was the murderer's chosen The question was who was playing, which role. She exhaled, writing down a name beside Peter Abbott's, the King. A man whose past held quiet secrets, a family history, linked to an old scandal. Had he been targeted for a crime long forgotten? And then Iris, the Queen, the weeping figure in the rhyme, but Iris had not been known for grief, widowed for years. Yes, but not a woman consumed by sorrow. If this was truly the pattern, then who or what was she meant to represent? Her gaze fell to the empty space below the names. The knave, the one who fled, Miss Marple. Frowned was the next victim already chosen. The thought sent a chill through her. Not from fear, but from urgency. This was not a case of random murders. This was a deliberate path, a story unfolding, with careful precision. And if she was right, if the murderer was methodically reenacting the rhyme, then there would be another death unless she stopped them first. Her fingers tightened around the pencil, and she leaned forward, sketching the first line of what she hoped would be the answer. Before it was too late, somewhere in this village, someone was playing a game, and Miss Marple intended to end it before the final verse was sung. The village of St. Mary Me, for all its genteel charm, was not accustomed to fear. It was a place where the postman knew everyone's business before they did, where the grocer boy still tipped his cap to passing ladies, and where the most pressing concern on an ordinary day might be the precise etiquette of borrowing a neighbor's pruning shears. But this was no ordinary day. Miss Marple sat in her parlor, a cup of tea cooling on the table beside her, as she reread the hastily scrawled note that had been slipped under her door early that morning. "It isn't over. Watch the clock, the next will be soon." It was unsigned, of course, but the words had a quiet urgency that sent a shiver down her spine. Watch the clock. Miss Marple rarely ignored advice, especially when it was cryptic. She reached for her notebook, flipping through the pages where she had meticulously recorded every detail of the case: the deaths of Peter Abbott and Iris Henderson, the playing card, the white lily, the connections to the old nursery rhyme. And then she saw it, a simple fact she had noted days ago, but had not yet considered in full. Both victims had died on anniversaries of events tied to an old village scandal. Peter Abbott's murder had fallen on the anniversary of Rhett Abbott's disgrace, the day he had been dismissed from the parish and vanished into obscurity. Iris Henderson's death had occurred on the anniversary of Sarah Pem's disappearance, the young woman whose ruin had been conveniently forgotten by those who preferred their pasts neatly swept under the rug. And now, if the pattern held, Miss Marple's fingers tightened around her pencil as she quickly scanned her notes. The next significant date was tonight. She exhaled sharply. That was what the note had meant. The killer was following a timeline. Miss Marple reached for her shawl, rising from her chair with uncharacteristic haste. She had spent the last week carefully untangling the past, but now the future was rushing toward her, and she would not, could not, let the murderer reach their next victim. The village clock tower, standing solemnly in the center of St. Mary Mead, chimed once. The warning in the note echoed in her mind: watch the clock. Time was running out. The air was damp with the scent of rain-soaked earth, and a thick mist curled around the hedgerow, as three figures stood concealed in the shadows outside St. Mary Me's old vicarage. The clock tower in the village square had just struck 11. Each toll reverberating through the stillness, like the slow, deliberate heartbeat of the night. Miss Marple, bundled in a practical woolen coat, stood with Colonel Bantry and Constable Graves, both men radiating varying degrees of skepticism. The colonel, accustomed to more traditional forms of conflict, had taken some convincing to participate in what he had muttered was a rather theatrical escape. Graves, on the other hand, had agreed with his usual begrudging air, muttering about how he wasn't about to let some old woman stumble into a real murderer's hands. Miss Marple, for her part, had ignored both men's complaints with quiet amusement. "I don't know why we couldn't have done this from inside the pub," muttered Colonel Bantry, shifting uncomfortably in his heavy coat. "One can conduct an excellent stakeout with a brandy in hand, because Arthur—" Miss Marple whispered patiently, "the murder is not taking place inside the pub, and one really must be present to prevent it." Bantry harped, but said no more. Constable Graves checked his pocket watch and exhaled slowly, Still don't see what makes you so certain. This is the next location, Miss Marple. She adjusted her gloves because Henry. We are following a pattern and the murderer is quite fond of theatrics. The first 2 deaths were tied to their respective places of disgrace. The vicarage, you may recall, was where Ret Abbott's life was undone. Graves scowled. That was over 40 years ago. Yes, she murmured, eyes scanning the empty street. But old wounds do have a way of festering, don't they? A hush settled over them once more, the stillness of the village stretching taut. Miss Marple stood perfectly composed, her keen eyes watching the vicarage door, the shuttered windows, the narrow garden gate. There was something almost too quiet about the scene, as though the village itself was holding its breath, and then a rustling noise. It was slight, barely more than a whisper against the cobbled path, but Miss Merrill caught it at once. Colonel Bantry stiffened beside her. Graves, suddenly alert, motioned for silence, as his hand went instinctively to his trunnion. Another sound this time, a creak as though weight had shifted on an old wooden floorboard. It came from the vicarage. Miss Marple's pulse quickened. Somewhere in the darkness, a shadow moved. The 3 of them remained motionless, barely daring to breathe. Then a sudden sharp clatter, as though something had been knocked over inside the house. Graves muttered a curse under his breath. That's it, I'm going in. No, Ma, Marl said, sharply enough that both men hesitated. Wait. Seconds passed. The night previously, so heavy with silence, had come alive with tension. A figure emerged, just a flicker of movement against the darkness, a tall, slender silhouette slipping through the side gate, moving with the careful precision of someone who did not wish to be seen. Miss Marple inhaled. The murderer had arrived, and she was ready the moment the shadowed figure slipped through the vicarage gate. The tension in the air thickened like an oncoming storm. Constable Graves, never one to tolerate prolonged inaction, shifted his weight forward, ready to intervene. Merle, however, was faster. Her hand, surprisingly firm for a woman of her age, closed around his arm. Wait, Henry, she murmured. Her voice was calm, but her eyes were razor-sharp, fixed on the silhouette disappearing into the garden's depths. For a moment it seemed as though nothing would happen. The village held its breath. Then a sudden noise, a thud followed by the crash of something heavy being knocked over. Bantry swore under his breath. That's it, I'm. Before he could move, the Vic's side door burst open. A tall figure dashed out into the moonlight, their coat flaring behind them like a shadow in flight. Graves shouted, "Stop!" The figure did not stop. They ran. It was instinct rather than deliberation that propelled Miss Merrill forward, her feet quick. Despite the damp cobblestones, she did not need to chase. She only needed to see, and as the fleeing figure disappeared down the lane, she did a glimpse of something small flattering to the ground in their wake, a single slip of paper torn and caught in the breeze. Miss Marple reached it before the others, stooping to pluck it from the stones. A note hastily written, the ink smudged as though in a hurry. She turned it over, and for the briefest moment, her breath caught the final line of the nursery rhyme script with deliberate intent, and then was seen again. Miss Marple's fingers tightened around the paper behind her. Bantry and Graves were still speaking, arguing about whether to give chase, about what to do next, but she did not hear them. Her mind had leapt ahead faster than either of them could run. This was not just a reference. This was not just a clue. This was a warning. The final act in the pattern was about to play out, and if she did not stop it, someone in St. Mary Me was about to disappear forever. Miss Merrill straightened her expression, unreadable, and turned toward the others. "We have no time to waste," she said crisply. "We must move now." The fire in the bank's drawing room crackled softly, casting flickering light against the heavy drapes and polished mahogany furniture. The air, warm from the hearth, yet cool with unease, carried the faint scent of lavender and pipe smoke, remnants of a time when this room had hosted far more mundane affairs than the gathering unfolding before them. The soft ticking of the clock on the mantel was the only sound that seemed to break the tension, as if it too feared what might happen next. Miss Marple, perched delicately in her usual spot, exuded an aura of quiet composure. Her hands, though steady, gripped a delicate china teacup, untouched by the time that passed. Her gaze, sharp and calculating, swept the room as the uncomfortable silence grew heavier, thick with anticipation. Around her, the people of St. Mary Mead sat like pieces on a chessboard, each one strategically placed, each one holding a secret, a motive or a truth they weren't yet ready to share. The tension was palpable, the room humming with the strain of unspoken words. Dolly Bantry, as always, seemed to be the most vocal of them all, though she was anything but calm. Her sharp eyes darted about, constantly shifting as though expecting the murderer to leap out at any moment. Her breath was shallow, her excitement and anxiety a volatile mix. Beside her, Colonel Bantry sat with the stoic resolve of a man who had seen too much, his military posture betraying his impatience with the drawn-out proceedings. The long hours in this room were beginning to wear on him, and it showed in the tightness of his jaw. Across the room, Dr. Ellsworth, the village physician, sat with his thin fingers drumming absently against his knee. His calm exterior masked an inner turmoil, the shadow in his eyes betraying thoughts that were carefully hidden behind the mask of professionalism. He had attended to both victims, after all. Both Peter Abbott and Iris Henderson had passed through his hands, but he said little. His silence spoke volumes, and Miss Marple could see that the man's mind was racing, seeking answers to questions he wasn't prepared to ask. Beside him, Reverend Milton, mild, bespectacled, and ever so polite, sat with his hands tightly folded in his lap, his gaze fixed on the floor, as though seeking some form of comfort from the worn wood beneath him. He had once presided over the vicarage, where Peter Abbott had fallen into disgrace, and Miss Marple couldn't help but notice the flicker of recognition in his eyes whenever the victims' names were mentioned. Though he had been but a young curate at the time, she was sure his memory was sharper than he let on. Edith Phelps, one of the oldest and most respected residents of St. Mary Mead, perched stiffly in her chair, her lips pursed tightly in disapproval. "I fail to see why I was needed here," she muttered, her voice tinged with annoyance, though Miss Marple saw the curiosity lurking behind the harsh words. The old woman may have protested, but the fact was, she was here like the others, pulled into the orbit of a mystery that she could not resist. Finally, Henry Graves, the local constable, stood near the door, his arms folded across his chest, watching the room with a mixture of irritation and reluctant duty. He wasn't fond of these proceedings, Miss Marple could tell, and the lack of progress in the investigation was wearing on him. The truth, he knew, was somewhere in this room, but no one was speaking it aloud. Miss Marple allowed the silence to stretch, letting discomfort settle over the group like a thick fog. She waited until the tension became almost unbearable before she spoke, her voice soft but deliberate. "You must forgive me for gathering you all here under such unusual circumstances," she began, her eyes scanning the faces before her, taking in every detail. "But as I am sure you have all realized, we are not dealing with ordinary murders." There was a shifting of seats, an anxious shuffle, as a few glances were exchanged nervously. Miss Marple let the pause linger, watching the subtle signs of unease. "I have spent the past week attempting to untangle the threads of this crime," she continued, her words deliberate, each one chosen for its weight. "And as with all great mysteries, the key to solving it lies in the past." A collective shift in the room told her that her statement had struck a chord. A few of them, Miss Marple noted, stiffened. Edith Phelps, in particular, looked as though she might speak, but the words remained trapped in her throat. "Peter Abbott," Miss Marple said, her voice cutting through the tension. "Iris Henderson. Both victims carefully chosen. Both left with symbolic objects." She let the weight of her words hang in the air as the room reacted with a slight gasp. The symbolism was not lost on anyone. "A playing card," Miss Marple added, her gaze steady, "and a white lily." It was the detail that tied the two murders together, the one thread that could unravel everything. As she spoke, Miss Marple noted the subtle shift in Edith Phelps' posture. She was already bracing herself, Miss Marple could see, for the inevitable question. "It is not the work of a madman, as some have suggested," Miss Marple continued, her voice calm but edged with a firm certainty. "This is a game, a performance played according to a nursery rhyme." The room went deathly still, the air thickened, the silence becoming a heavy cloak. Edith Phelps, her lips pursed tightly, allowed herself a small involuntary sound, a sharp intake of breath. Miss Marple turned her gaze to her. "You recall it, don't you, Miss Phelps?" she asked, her voice soft, yet insistent. "The rhyme about the King of Hearts." Edith hesitated, her fingers gripping the arm of her chair, but then with a resigned sigh she spoke, her voice tight with reluctance. "The King of Hearts, he made a tart, and so they stole it. The Queen, she wept. The knave, he fled, and then was seen again." The words hung in the air, unsettling in their simplicity. A nursery rhyme, yes, but one with far deeper implications than anyone could have imagined. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly, and she nodded, her expression thoughtful. "A seemingly innocent rhyme," she said, her voice taking on a quiet but certain tone. "But as I have come to realize, it is the foundation for these murders. Each line is a clue, each action mirrored in the crimes committed here. What I am about to uncover may change everything you think you know about this village." The room held its breath. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fit together, and yet, Miss Marple knew that the most dangerous part of the game was just about to begin. Crimes, a stolen tart, a grieving queen, a fleeing knave, and now we are at the final act. Reverend Milton shifted uncomfortably. "Are you saying the murderer is following this pattern deliberately?" Miss Marple inclined her head. "I am. And when one follows such a pattern, one must ask who is playing. What role?" A silence. Dr. Elworth cleared his throat. "But what does it mean?" "A rhyme is just a rhyme, Miss Marple." Miss Marple counted. "We must look to the past to understand it." She folded her hands in her lap. Rhett Abbott was disgraced, a scandal hushed up a young woman, ruined a secret that was meant to be forgotten. Her gaze swept across the room, but someone did not forget. She let the words settle, then slowly she continued. "Peter Abbott, the King of Hearts, the heir to a tarnished name, he was the price to be paid for his father's misdeeds. Iris Henderson, the grieving queen. Not a queen in the literal sense, of course, but a woman left behind bearing the weight of what had been stolen." Reverend Milton's face had gone pale. "You don't mean?" Miss Marr's eyes sharpened. "Oh, but I do, Sarah. Pembroke, the woman whose life was destroyed by Rhett Abbott's betrayal." A chill passed through the room. "She was sent away," Miss Marple continued. "And yet we do not know what became of her." Edith Phelps stirred. There were rumors. Her voice was barely above a whisper. Miss Marple nodded. "Indeed. And if she had a child," she let the suggestion linger, "a child born of scandal, raised in the shadow of a mother's grief, a child who had grown year by year, nursing an inherited wound, shaping their identity around an injustice never made right, a child who had returned to St. Mary." Me intent on settling the score, Miss Marple placed her hands on the arms of her chair. "And that brings us to the final line of the rhyme." The room held its breath. "The knave, he fled, and then was seen again." A pause, then in a voice quiet yet firm, Miss Marple said, "The final murder will not be an act of vengeance, but an act of escape." Dr. Elworth frowned. "Escape?" Miss Marple nodded. "The murderer has been reenacting this rhyme, step by step, if they are following the pattern precisely, then the last act is not a killing, it is a disappearance." The realization dawned slowly across the faces in the room, which means, she added, rising to her feet, "we are not searching for a murderer preparing to strike again, we are searching for a murderer who is about to vanish." The grandfather clock in the hall chimed midnight. Miss Marple's lips pressed into a thin line. Had very little time left. The fire had burned low in the Van Price drawing room, its embers glowing faintly in the hearth. The assembled group sat in tense still, the weight of Miss Marple's words still lingering in the air. A murderer poised to vanish. Miss Marple, ever composed, folded her hands neatly in her lap. "We are dealing," she began, her voice steady, with a crime that was never meant to be solved. The murders were not merely acts of violence, but a carefully staged performance. Each step, each clue was a calculated reference to a past injustice, one that has been meticulously avenged in the present. Pause, then with the precision of a weaver threading her final stitch, she laid out the pattern. "Peter Abbott," she said, "was the first. He represented the King of Hearts, the one who made a tart." She glanced at the faces around her, ensuring they followed. A tart, as you may recall, was stolen in the nursery. Rhyme, a metaphor, I believe, for something else, a betrayal. Dr. Ellsworth stirred. "You believe this refers to Rupert Abbott?" Miss Marple inclined her head. "Indeed, the Abbott family name has long been associated with the scandal of the missing church funds, but I believe the real theft was not money at all. The true tart that was stolen was Sarah Pembroke's future." Reverend Milton exhaled, his hands clasped tightly. Miss Marple continued, her tone measured. "Sarah Pembroke was ruined by Rhett, Abbott cast out in disgrace. The village, preferring to forget unpleasantness, let her name slip into obscurity. But someone did not forget." Dolly Bantry let out a small gasp. "The child, Miss Apple." Nodded precisely. She let the significance settle before pressing on. She said next was the second victim. A widow, a woman who lived in quiet solitude. She was killed on the anniversary of Sarah Pem's disappearance, and a white lily was left upon her lap, a symbol of mourning, muttered Edith Phelps. Miss Marple gave a faint smile. "A grieve queen." The second line of the rhyme, the queen. She wept. A shiver ran through the room. Colonel Bantry cleared his throat. "But why, Iris Henderson? What did she have to do with all this?" Miss Marple's expression darkened slightly. "As my dear Arthur, is where human nature comes into play. Iris Henderson was no innocent bystander. She was one of the few who knew the truth about Sarah Pembroke, and kept silent. She lived with knowledge she never shared, and for that she, too, was marked," Dolly Bantry whispered. "And now we come to the last part of the rhyme." Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, the knave. He fled, and N was seen again." A silence fell. It was Henry Graves who spoke first. "So the killer, whoever they are, is planning to disappear." Miss Marple met his gaze. "Yes, and I believe they have planned it quite carefully." She reached into her handbag and retrieved the scrap of paper found during the stake-out. "This note," she said, holding it up, "was dropped by the very person we are looking for. They were at the vicarage last night, tying up loose ends before vanishing." She turned the paper, over-reading the final line aloud. "And N was seen again." A hush fell over the room. Miss Marple surveyed the faces before her, her expression calm yet watchful. "This is the final step in their plan. If we do not act swiftly, our murderer will slip away just as the rhyme dictates." Ellsworth's face was pale. "But who is it, Miss Marple?" Miss Marple allowed herself a small knowing smile. "My dear doctor," she said, rising to her feet, "I believe I have known the answer for quite some time, and if we move quickly, I rather think we may prevent the final act from being completed." She turned toward the door. "We have a murderer to catch." The band's drawing room was steeped in silence, broken only by the occasional crack of the fire, and the ticking of the grand clock on the mantel outside. The village slumbered in uneasy ignorance, unaware that within these walls, a drama as old as time itself was reaching its climax. Miss Marple, poised yet unassuming, stood at the center of the room. Her delicate hands rested lightly on the back of an armchair, her gaze sweeping over the assembled figures. Though her expression remained kind, there was something in her pale blue eyes, a sharpness, an unwavering certainty that made the occupants of the room shift ever so slightly in their seats. The moment of revelation had arrived. She spoke with the quiet authority of one who had long since pieced together the truth. "We have followed a pattern," she began, a game played with deadly precision. "Two murders, each mirroring the lines of an old nursery rhyme. Peter Abbott, the king; Iris Henderson, the queen. The crime of vengeance, rooted in the past. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle before continuing. And now the final act. The knave who fled and was never seen again. A flicker of movement, small, almost imperceptible, drew her attention, a tightening of the jaw, a shift of posture, not panic, not yet, but reckon. Miss Marple pressed on. Who among us has been playing this dreadful game? And though the answer was hidden well, the truth, as it so often does, revealed itself in the smallest of details. She turned her gaze toward Dr. Ellsworth, who had remained unnervingly quiet. "It was you, wasn't it, Doctor?" A gasp. Dr. Ellsworth, who had been reclining in his chair, suddenly stiffened. "Miss Marple," he said with forced composure, "this is a very serious accusation." She nodded gently. "Oh yes, Doctor. Very serious indeed." A murmur rippled through the room, but Miss Marple remained composed. She turned to the others. "Dr. Ellsworth came to St. Mary's nearly a decade ago, respectable, well-mannered, trusted. But what few people knew was that his mother was a woman named Sarah Pembroke." A collective intake of breath. Ellsworth's hands curled slightly on the arms of his chair. Miss Marple continued, her voice softer now, almost sympathetic. "You were born in secrecy, sent away with your mother when she was cast out of this village. I imagine you grew up with the knowledge of what had been done to her. The man who had ruined her life and vanished without consequence. And I imagine that knowledge festered." The doctor exhaled, but said nothing. Miss Marple stepped forward. "For years you waited. And when the moment came when you found yourself back in this village, you saw your chance to rewrite history. She let the words sink in. You chose Peter Abba first, because his father was the source of your mother's ruin. Then Iris Henderson, because she had known and she had remained silent." Dr. Ellsworth's gaze flickered just for a moment. Miss Marple gave a knowing smile. "But you made a mistake, Doctor, a small one." But significant silence. She reached into her handbag and withdrew the slip of paper they had found at the vicarage the night before. "You left a note behind when you fled, Doctor. And in your haste you used the very ink and stationery that can be found in your own medical office." A beat of silence. Then for the first time Dr. Ellsworth's carefully composed mask cracked. Dolly Bantry let out a breath. She hadn't realized she'd been holding Colonel Bantry. Muttered, "Good Lord." Ellsworth's jaw tense for a moment. It seemed as though he might protest, but then, as if a great weight had been lifted from him, he simply leaned back in his chair and exhaled a weary smile. Something almost wry tugged at his lips. "Well," he murmured, "I suppose there's no sense in denying it now, is there?" Miss Marple gave a sad little nod. No, there was not. The game was over, and the knave had been caught before he could flee. The drawing room of the Jera had never held so many secrets at once. The fire burned low, flickering shadows along the mahogany-paneled walls, and the heavy velvet drapes muffled the sounds of the village. Beyond, inside, the tension was thick, an unspoken weariness settling over the assembled guests. This was no ordinary gathering. Miss Marple, seated primly in her usual armchair, surveyed the room with an expression of serene composure. Her delicate hands rested lightly on the arms of her chair, her posture that of a woman merely observing. Yet the sharpness in her gaze told another story. Around her sat the key players in this deadly game. Dolly Bantry, watching with barely concealed excitement, her fingers twitching against the embroidery on her lap. Colonel Bantry, stiff-backed and impatient, his arms crossed in a soldier's posture of readiness. Dr. Ellsworth, the man at the center of it all, composed but tense, his eyes darting toward the door as though already planning an exit. Reverend Milton, pale and grim, his hands clasped together, as if in silent prayer. Henry Graves, the village constable, stationed near the fireplace, with the wee expression of a man who would rather be anywhere else. Edith Phelps, watching everything with an air of quiet calculation, her lips pursed, her fingers clasped together so tightly they had gone white. No one spoke. Then Miss Marple sighed softly, adjusting the lace cuffs of her sleeves. She said at last, her voice gentle but firm, "Is never quite as simple as it seems, Doctor." Ellsworth exhaled sharply through his nose. I should think it is quite simple, Miss Marple. The police have their man. She turned to him with a mild smile. Do they, Doctor? A flicker of hesitation. She folded her hands in her lap. 2 deaths, both carefully staged, a playing card, a white lily, symbols chosen, with precision reflecting a nursery rhyme that tells a tale of betrayal and justice. Her voice remains steady, measured, a crime that is not new, but rather a reenactment of one long past. A hush. Colonel Bantry cleared his throat. We all know the rhyme now, Jane. And we all know you found the pattern. King of Hearts, the one who made the tart, the Queen, the one who wept, and now the knave, the one who must flee ere. Miss Marple's smile did not move, but his fingers curled slightly over the arm of his chair. Miss Mar's smile did not waver. Yes, and that is where we find ourselves now, do we not? The murderer, having exacted their revenge, now intends to disappear, just as the rhyme dictates a shifting in the room. But she continued, one must consider the method, the precision, the patience. It must have taken to wait all these years to plan each step so carefully. Such a crime is not committed in haste. Her eyes locked onto Dr. Ellsworth's. No, she said softly. Was written in ink, long before it was written in blood. A silence. Dolly Bantry whispered. But how? Miss Merrill turned toward the others, her tone thoughtful, almost sympathetic. Dr. Ellsworth has been our trusted physician for years. The very man who pronounced both victims dead, the man who by his own profession understands the delicate balance between life and death better than anyone. She leaned forward slightly, and yet she said he failed to consider one thing. Dr. Ellsworth's jaw tensed. Miss Merrill reached into her handbag and withdrew a second playing card, one Graves had recovered from Ellsworth's own medical office. The Jack of Spades, she said quietly. Another hush. Miss Merrill turned the card over, scrolled in ink with the words. An N was seen again. Miss Merrill tilted her head, observing him with something close to pity. You were planning to stage your own disappearance, weren't you? Doctor, a tragic accident. Perhaps a body found in the river, a body that would never be found at all. The color drained from his face. Graves stepped forward instinctively, his fingers grazing his trunnion. But Dr. Ellsworth did not run. Instead, after a long excruciating pause, he let out a slow breath and leaned back into his chair. Well, he murmured, that's rather clever, isn't it? Miss Marple regarded him gently. Clever perhaps, but doomed to fail. You see, Doctor, there is one thing no criminal ever accounts for. He lifted an eyebrow. And what is that? Miss Merrill smiled. Human nature. And just like that, the game was over. The knave, for all his cunning, had been caught before he could flee. The silence in the Bantys' drawing room had become a living thing, thick, oppressive, coiling around the gathered figures like an unseen spectre. The fire crackled in the hearth, its low rhythmic popping, the only sound in the room as the weight of Miss Marple's quiet accusation settled upon Dr. Ellsworth. For a long moment he did not speak. His fingers traced an absent pattern along the polished arm of his chair. His eyes, which had always carried a certain clinical detachment, now flickered with something else, something dark and uncertain. The room watched him. Miss Marple remained serene, her hands resting lightly in her lap as if she had merely asked about the weather. But there was still beneath her composure. She had seen it before this moment. When guilt, when faced with an undeniable truth, began to eat through even the strongest defenses, Colonel Bantry, never one for patience, exhaled sharply. Come now, Doctor, say something, man. Dr. Ellsworth let out a quiet chuckle, bitter-edged with something dangerously close to relief. What would you have me say? He murmured, almost to himself. That I'm sorry, that I regret what I've done. Dolly Bantry leaned forward, eyes wide. Do you? Ellsworth turned toward her, his expression unreadable. Would it matter if I did? Miss Merrill tilted her head slightly. It would matter a great deal, Doctor. A pause, then at last he spoke. Do you know, he said almost conversationally, how long I have waited for this? His gaze swept over the room, lingering on Miss Marple, then drifting to the others. Graves, the Bant, Reverend Milton, Edith Phelps, all of you," he said quietly, "sitting here in this warm, comfortable room talking of justice, of wrong and right. But none of you were there, were you? None of you saw what was done." Reverend Milton shifted uneasily. "Dr. Ellsworth, my mother Ellsworth," cut in his voice, cold now, "was destroyed. Do you understand that she was ruined?" A heavy pause. "I grew up with her stories," he continued, his voice lower, filled with quiet fury. "The whispered disgrace, the people who turned their backs, the shame she bore. And all the while Rhett Abbott lived comfortably in London, never answering for what he had done. His family never suffered, not a single consequence." Miss Merrill regarded him with quiet understanding. "And so you waited?" Ellsworth let out a breathless laugh. "Yes, Miss Marple, I waited when I came here. When I became the trusted village doctor, I watched, I listened, and when the time came I made sure that the sins of the past were finally repaid." His voice grew quieter. "Peter Abbott first, the son of a thief made to answer for his father's crimes." A murmur ran through the room, but no one interrupted Iris Henderson. He went on, his jaw tightening. "Because she knew what had been done, and she said nothing. Lived her life in peace while my mother lived hers in shadows." Miss Merrill observed him carefully. "And you would have vanished after the third act." He turned to her, his expression unreadable. "It was never about me, it was about them. The past demanded justice, and I gave it a pause, and then unexpectedly." He laughed, a tired hollow sound. "Oh, foolish," he murmured. "How poetic I thought a story played out to its final note, and yet in the end here I am." He shook his head. "Not nearly as clever as I had imagined." Miss Merrill gave a small knowing smile. "Oh, but that is where you are wrong, Doctor." He lifted an eyebrow. She folded her hands in her lap. "You were very clever, but cleverness, you see, is not the same as wisdom, and when one builds their world on revenge, one often forgets the simplest truth of all." She leaned forward slightly, her voice gentle but firm. "People remember." A silence settled once more. Then, with a quiet, resigned sigh, Dr. Ellsworth leaned back against the chair. And this time he did not protest when Henry Graves stepped forward, resting a heavy hand upon his shoulder. It was over. The nursery rhyme had reached its final verse. The room remained still, the charge, silence stretching long after Dr. Ellsworth's final words had faded. The fire flickered in the hearth, its embers glowing faintly, but the warmth did little to dispel the cold weight of realization that had settled over the gathering Constable Henry Graves. His face set in an expression of grim duty. "Finally spoke well," he said, clearing his throat. "I reckon that settles it." Dr. Ellsworth did not resist as Graves stepped forward, producing a pair of handcuffs from his coat pocket. There was no dramatic protest, no frantic attempt to escape. Only the quiet resignation of a man who had long since accepted the consequences of his actions. As Graves secured the cuffs around his wrists, Ellsworth let out a soft, wry chuckle. "You for years I imagined how this would end," he murmured. "But I never thought it would be her who caught me." He lifted his gaze toward Miss Marple, who sat primly in her chair, as composed as ever. She gave him a small, sad smile. "Smile. Murder, my dear doctor, is a most untidy thing. It has a way of unraveling no matter how carefully one weaves it." Dolly Bantry, who had been watching the proceedings with wide eyes, exhaled sharply. "Well, I must say I never imagined it was him." She whispered to her husband, all these years tending to people's ailments, and yet all the while Colonel Bantry gave a small grunt. Bit of a shock. "But I rather think Jane had it worked out days ago." Miss Merrill simply gave a modest smile. Dr. Ellsworth glanced at her again, his expression unreadable. "Tell me, Miss Merrill," he said, his voice quieter. "Now, if I had been just a little less careful, left out the playing card perhaps, or the lily, you think I might have gotten away with it?" Miss Merrill tilted her head slightly, considering the question for a time. Perhaps she conceded. But murder, doctor, is not so easily forgotten as one might wish. You see, people, particularly in villages, remember things, small things, an overheard remark, a misplaced object, a look, exchanged at the wrong moment, and eventually those little things add up. She folded her hands in her lap. You may have followed your nursery rhyme to its end. But you see, a nursery rhyme is only a story, and stories do not account for real people. Real people have a way of interfering, Ellsworth let out. A breathless laugh, indeed they do. Constable Graves gave him a firm nudge toward the door. Come along then. As the doctor was led away, the tension in the room eased slightly, though it left behind an odd lingering weight. The game was over, and yet the knowledge that such a crime had taken root in Smerry, me carefully, deliberately, was not easily shaken. Reverend Milton sighed heavily, rubbing a hand over his face. It is a terrible thing, he murmured. How long grief and resentment confessed her that a crime so old could still cause death after all these years. Miss Marple regarded him thoughtfully. Yes, Reverend, it is a terrible thing indeed. The past does not always stay buried, especially when there is someone determined to dig it up. Dolly Bantry leaned forward, lowering her voice. Do you really think he regretted it? Jane, Miss Marple sighed softly. Perhaps in the end, but regret is a curious thing. Dolly, some feel it before they act, others only after they have been caught. Dolly shivered slightly, a rather chilling thought. Miss Marple smiled, but there was something wistful in her expression. Yes, dear, but then again, murder is a most chilling thing. She reached for her knitting, pulling it neatly onto her lap. The village clock outside struck the hour, its chime carrying through the quiet air. Life in Aunt Mary Me would return to normal as it always did. Tea would be poured, gardens tended, gossip exchanged, but beneath it all the village had changed, if only a little, because even in the quietest of places, the past is never truly past. The air in Smerry Meet had changed. It was not something tangible, nor something that could be observed outright. The hedge remained neatly trimmed, the postman still made his daily rounds, and the morning mist still clung stubbornly to the rooftops, before burning away beneath the pale autumn sun. But beneath the surface of the village's gentle rhythms, there was an unspoken understanding. Something dark had passed through, and though it had been caught and caged, it had left a mark. The talk had not ceased. Of course it never did at the Bluebell Tea Room. Mrs. Bartlett and Miss Harrell exchanged whispered theories over cups of weak Earl Grey, speculating whether Dr. Ellsworth had ever truly planned to flee, or whether Miss Marple had simply outmaneuvered him before he could make up his mind. At the greengrocer's, young Nancy had been heard remarking that she always found the doctor a bit too quiet, and that one ought to be wary of a man who never takes sugar in his tea. And at the Grange, Colonel and Dolly Bantry sat in their drawing-room, watching the fire flicker in the hearth, discussing the matter with a gravity they rarely reserved for anything outside of estate affairs. Dolly Bantry, curled up in a chintz armchair, turned to her husband with a sigh. It's a peculiar thing, Arthur, to think we've lived alongside him all these years, and yet none of us ever suspected a thing. Colonel Bantry settled in his usual chair, with a copy of the Times folded across his lap, grunted. Well, of course we didn't suspect him, Dolly. He was the doctor. People trust doctors same as vicar and policeman. No one ever thinks to question them. He shook his head. Damn clever of Miss Marple, though I'll give her that. Dolly hummed in agreement, stirring her tea absent-mindedly. Does make one think, though, about secrets. Arthur glanced at her over the top of his paper. What about them? Dolly frowned. How they never really go away. I suppose everyone in the village had all but forgotten about Sarah Pembroke and Rupert Abbott, hadn't they? But it didn't matter in the end. The past caught up whether we remembered it or not. Arthur exhaled, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. Suppose that's true enough. Dolly hesitated before continuing, her voice quieter. Now do you think it was justice, Arthur? Husband looked at her. Surprised what she lifted her gaze to his, her expression unusually serious. What Dr. Ellsworth did. Do you think it was justice or just revenge, dressed up as something righteous? Arthur was silent for a long moment then. With a sigh he set his newspaper aside and leaned forward, elbows on his knees. Justice is a fine thing in theory, Dolly, but in practice, well, it's not as neat as one would like. He reached for his whiskey glass and swirled the amber liquid. Murders still murder, no matter what cause a man thinks he's serving. Dolly nodded slowly. Yes, she murmured. I suppose that's the bitter part of justice, isn't it? It never quite feels as good as one hopes it will. Arthur said nothing, only took a slow sip of his drink. Outside the village, continued its slow return to normality. The butcher's boy whistled as he made his deliveries. A pair of children played a game of marbles in the street, their laughter bright and unburdened, and at the vicarage, Reverend Milton prepared his Sunday sermon. One that would no doubt speak gently of redemption, of the long reach of the past, and of the fragile hopeful thing that was forgiveness. For life in Smerry Me would go on as it always did, but some wounds, even in the quietest of villages, never truly fade. The quiet hum of the village had returned. Miss Morell sat by the fire in her small tidy sitting room, the flames casting a warm glow across the delicate lace doilies and well-worn books that lined the shelves. Outside, the familiar sounds of Smerry Me drifted in the distant clatter of a milk cart, the murmured voices of neighbors exchanging pleasantries. The occasional bark of a dog, life as it always did, had resumed its usual rhythm. She reached for her knitting, her fingers moving automatically as she stared into the fire. The case, the murders, the revelations, the slow unraveling of secrets, was now behind her, and yet, as always, it lingered in her mind, weaving itself into the broader tapestry of human nature that she had spent a lifetime observing. She had never been one for melodrama. Murder, despite its often dramatic presentation, was rarely about the grand passions that filled the pages of novels. No, it was something much simpler, much more human: greed, resentment, fear, love, misplaced, denied or betrayed. Dr. Ellsworth's crime had not been one of sudden rage, nor one of reckless ambition. It had been slow and patient, built upon years of quiet anger, fed by the echoes of a past, could never escape. Morell let out a small sigh, setting down her knitting. The past was a curious thing. One could ignore it, bury it, pretend it had no consequence, but sooner or later, it had a way of pushing to the surface, demanding to be acknowledged. She had seen it before, time and again. The careful respectability of a village did little to obscure the truths that lay beneath its surface. People live their lives in small, seemingly inconsequential ways, never realizing how each decision, each moment was merely a stitch in a greater pattern, and yet it was always the smallest details that unraveled the greatest secrets. A misplaced card, a forgotten nursery rhyme, a hesitation in a voice, a flicker of emotion too quickly masked. She smiled to herself. The truth in the end was never truly hidden. It only required the right eyes to see it. Reaching for her cup of tea, she took a careful sip of her tea, and Miss Marple settled back into her chair, the warm liquid offering a fleeting moment of comfort amidst the stillness of the room. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, its embers glowing like the remnants of an old secret, and the clock on the mantel ticked steadily, its rhythmic sound both soothing and unnerving in its persistence. Beyond the window, the village of St. Mary Mead carried on as it always had, blissfully unaware of the quiet musings of an elderly woman who, despite her age, possessed a mind as sharp as ever, and an understanding of human nature that few could match. The case was closed, yes, but there were always deeper currents beneath the surface, currents that didn't so easily settle. For Miss Marple, the truth of the matter had been revealed, but the endless complexities of human nature, those unspoken desires and dark impulses, were a puzzle that would never truly be solved. It was a mystery without end, an eternal game played by all, whether they were aware of it or not. The morning light streamed softly through the window, casting a pale gold hue over the village as the mist hung lazily over the hedgerows, reluctant to lift. It was a morning like any other, at least, that's how it appeared at first glance. The peace of St. Mary Mead seemed undisturbed, but in the quiet, beneath the everyday exchanges and trivial gossip, there was an undercurrent of change. At the grocer's, Mrs. Bartlett was already embroiled in a lively conversation with Miss Harnell, their voices rising and falling in rhythm, punctuated by scandalized gasps and occasional nods of agreement. It wasn't surprising that the events of the past weeks still loomed large in the village's collective mind. After all, a murder had a way of leaving a lasting mark, even in the most peaceful of places. Near the churchyard, Reverend Milton stood with a small group of parishioners, his voice low as he spoke to them while they tidied the flower beds. The sermon that Sunday had been one of reflection and redemption, exploring the long-reaching consequences of past deeds and the power of truth, no matter how painful. The words had been carefully chosen, but there was a weight to them, a heaviness that had resonated with more than just the parishioners. At the Bluebell Tea Room, young Nancy, bright-eyed and eager as ever, carried a tray of fresh scones to a table where Dolly Bantry and Edith Phelps were seated. The two women sat together, the air between them thick with gossip as they engaged in the serious business of village affairs. Yet, even as they spoke of trivial things, who was courting whom, who had planted roses in their garden, the latest fashions, a subtle shift had occurred. The events of the past few weeks had changed something in the village, and though it was a change they couldn't quite put their finger on, there was no denying it. St. Mary Mead, for all its charm and quiet life, had been altered, if only slightly. The shadow of murder, once hanging heavy over its picturesque cottages and peaceful lanes, was beginning to lift, but its trace still lingered in the air, as though the very soil of the village had absorbed something darker. Yet, the people of St. Mary Mead were resilient, as ever. They returned to their routines, to their whispers, to their small but essential joys, and life, though forever changed, continued. And in the midst of it all, Miss Marple sat in her neat, modest cottage, watching the world unfold from her window. Her knitting needles clicked softly in the quiet, the steady rhythm offering her a moment of peace, but her eyes, though soft with age, were sharp as ever as she took in the scene before her, the world continuing on, despite the darkness that had momentarily crept into its heart. She had seen it all before, of course. She had seen the way a village absorbed tragedy, how it turned the loss over in its mind like soil in a garden, discarding what it no longer needed, and keeping what it could not forget. It was always the same. People moved forward, some with a quiet relief, others with a determined energy that spoke of nothing more than the avoidance of darker thoughts. It was the human condition, after all, so much easier to move forward than to linger in the past. Miss Marple understood it. She admired it, in a way. The resilience of it all. Life in St. Mary Mead, she thought with a small knowing smile, was always full of little secrets. The carefully kept pasts, the minor deceptions, the half-truths buried beneath polite smiles, the illusion of simplicity that masked the tangled web beneath. It was what made this village so very interesting, and so very alive. With a quiet sigh, she picked up her cup of tea, her fingers curling around the warm porcelain. She took another sip, the warmth spreading through her, as she allowed herself a moment of calm. The morning was peaceful for now, but she knew better than anyone that peace was fleeting. For mysteries, like seasons, always had a way of returning, and in St. Mary Mead, life ever full of intrigue, would go on, ever changing, yet ever the same.